Headlines.
Critical progress FTP bug now being exploited in attacks. Cloudflare DDoS protections bypassed using Cloudflare, and the Red Cross issues hacktivist rules. These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have been bringing to you on this week's cybersecurity headlines. And now we get a chance for some insight, some opinion, and most definitely some expertise on these stories and more from our guest, Bob Schuetter, the CISO at Ashland. Bob, thanks so much for being here.
No, I appreciate you having me on. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. I can't wait to dig into the news with you. Before we do so, though, I have to give a moment and thank our sponsor for today, Conveyor. Spend 91% less time on security questionnaires with the most accurate AI generated answers on the market. Remember, you can join us on YouTube Live. To do so, go to CISOseries.com, hit the events dropdown, and look for the cybersecurity headlines week in review image. You can click on to join us, and then you can just subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're there, you can be making comments, joining in on the conversation all throughout this stream, and we will be talking to those, addressing those. If you have any questions, comments on the news, we want to hear them. Can't wait to see what everybody is going to contribute. We've got about 20 minutes, though, so let's just jump into the news. First up here, critical progress FTP bug is now being exploited in attacks. Following up on a story we covered last Friday regarding the maximum severity vulnerability in Progress Software's WSFTP server file sharing platform, the same day that researchers announced their proof of concept, cybersecurity firm Rapid7 revealed that attackers had begun exploiting the bug. Asset Note found that there are about 2,900 hosts running WSFTP on the internet. May not seem like that huge of a number unless your company is one of them. And as we've seen with MoveIt, these can have huge reach for each one of those organizations. Progress said that upgrading to a patch release using the full installer is the only way to address the issue. So, Bob, Progress seems to have done what it can to fix the vulnerability, but how does this make you feel overall about third-party risk inherent in architecture? Is it, I guess, better than having a collection of different suppliers? Like, I guess, where are your feels at with this story?
No, I think it's yet again another piece in a long line of these conversations, right? And what we're seeing from an intelligence perspective is, these types of groups and these types of service providers are getting more and more targeted,
Mm.
right? So I think from a responsible notification piece and responsible disclosure, that's going to be a hard thing in a conversation that we got to have, further and further in our industry. But certainly it's one from a third party risk perspective. Like I said, we've seen a tremendous shift in the last 6 months, really, towards that type of attack. Right? It's always the question of, why do you rob a bank? It's where all the money is. Right? I think this is just one of those pieces that we're going to have to get good at understanding, and again, good at disclosing responsibly.
All right, next up here, one that raised some eyebrows. Cloudflare DDoS protections bypass using Cloudflare. A researcher at Certitude has discovered that Cloudflare's firewall and DDoS prevention can be bypassed through a specific attack process that leverages logic flaws in cross-tenant security controls simply by using a free Cloudflare account. That's kind of the whole cross-tenant thing. Through a proof of concept, the researcher identified the source of the vulnerability to Cloudflare's strategy to use shared infrastructure that accepts connections from all tenants. He and his research colleague reported the logic flaws to Cloudflare on March 16th, but the issue was closed as informative, kind of the I'm sorry you feel that way, I guess, of bug disclosures. So, Bob, is this what you would refer to as a, I don't know, distributed service front door problem?
Yeah, maybe it's a distributed service backdoor problem.
Yeah.
I'm not sure which one it is, right?
Which door are we talking about?
But if you think about it, it's a combination of the conversation we've always had, right? User experience versus security.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about the Microsoft, when they went to Portal, right, for their Office front door, I'm like, okay, let something get straight. You're going to get a single spot where everyone knows what the website is. I give you a credential, and you're going to route me to the tenant where that credential works. Holy cow, we got rid of one layer of that, ease of use or a layer of security, depending on how you look at it. So, all of us said, boy, we better make sure we get this, tenant thing right. I think that's one of those big conversations that we can have within the industry, both from the cloud perspective, but especially as service providers. having kind of that back end old school thought of, hey, we trust ourselves. We're security professionals, right? Of course, we can do this properly. Bringing that up a level and bringing it into really context aware security for those service providers and especially tenant aware security. We really haven't talked a lot about that.
Yeah, I feel like this is, we to see this kind of. I haven't heard that specifically, tenant aware, but that seems to be the backdrop increasingly that we're seeing for a lot of this coverage. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that is the new buzzword.
I say it's a new startup waiting to happen. I'm sure.
VCs, you just send me 10 million, we can get started on
We
your
got it.
product right away. Next up here, Lazarus Group poses as meta recruiters to spearfish Spanish engineers. The Lazarus Group from North Korea has been identified as the source of a sophisticated attack, which involved posing as a recruiter from Meta, seeking to attract employees from a Spanish aerospace company. The interested candidates were then sent coding quizzes or challenges to solve as part of the application process. Asset describes the malware called Lightless Can, great name, as representing a significant advancement in malicious capabilities, especially since each piece of malware was specifically designed for each individual candidate's machine, which is really why this story really, I mean, spear phishing, we've seen it a bunch. That is another level. Lazarus Group certainly, top marks for persistence, creativity in their attacks, making the most of their resources, and throwing out that tempting job offer to Meta, giving people credible problems to solve to kind of disarm suspicions. If the customized software part of the story, holds water, and this isn't just okay, we did, it was some slight dusting of some settings, and this is true specificity, kind of takes spearfishing to a new level. What are your thoughts, Bob?
So I came from the defense industrial base. I came from an aerospace company.
Hmm.
So it certainly is nothing new from a true advanced persistent threat, right? So those that haven't seen this type of thing before, it's holy cow, this is amazing, to get this specific. But we've seen this for years. I think that the interesting twist on this is certainly that North Korea has now kind of entered the chat, if you will,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Of they have truly got to a level of appropriately calling them advanced persistent threat and getting to the level that it is customized, it is focused, and it is unique. So again, we've always seen pieces within our industry that is specific to us, specific to our malware that's made just for us, which is a little bit scary. But if you think about it too, I think the vendor space in our industry is a little bit backwards for this. That they're meant for protecting the generic, the mass produced components.
mhm,
They look at risk and say, "Boy, we have to protect as many customers as we can." So we put our resources into that. We put our resources into understanding these big, wide events. They don't necessarily look at the one-offs, right? And that's why it's so good, and that's why it's so hard to detect. Right, their level of risk is different than my level of risk, unfortunately.
yeah. A very good point. And we have James Driscoll in the chat contributing. Sounds like Lazarus is evolving their TTPs. Yeah, James,
Yep, agreed.
nailed it. Nailed it. All right, next up here, a new feature-rich malware as a service emerges. A new malware as a service, or MAS, if you want to be fancy, named Bunny Loader is advertised on multiple hacker forums as a fileless loader that can steal and replace the contents of a system clipboard. But it can also download and execute payloads, log keys, steal sensitive data and cryptocurrency, and execute remote commands, pretty much a Swiss Army knife, and throwing in some anti-detection mechanisms and info stealing capabilities. Bunny Loader is quickly becoming popular among cyber criminals due to its rich features, low price, and ease of use, even by low skilled criminals. This kind of shines a light on I guess, the UX side of cybercrime, making
Yeah.
something that's easy to use and full of toys. And hey, also, it's affordable. We're seeing more anti-detection being built in kind of across different malwares. I've definitely been noticing that just more advanced capabilities there as well. Clearly, the bad guys are reading their user satisfaction surveys and building that better mousetrap. I guess, where does that leave us as the mice?
Yeah, I think there's two big pieces here, right? One is certainly the UX,
Hmm.
and one of the most dangerous pieces that we've gotten into is, to your point, the malware developers understanding UX and making sure that it's easy for their customer base to implement and use. That's a classic business case, right?
Yeah.
That's good job on your side. Good, certainly good job on the naming convention. I love Bunny Loader. I'll
Yeah.
give you that one. But I think the other piece that wasn't really talked about a whole lot is the speed at which this thing was developed and rolled out, and new features were added into it. Right. So if you look a couple of years ago, even with ransomware as a service, when that popped up, if you want to be good at threat intelligence and track organized crime, you're only tracking 6 or 7 platforms, really.
Hmm.
Right. With this type of activity and with this type of accuracy from a capability and automation perspective, trying to make easy these really technically difficult hacking ideas, that's interesting. But doing it in 20 days, well, that's significant.
Yeah.
Right. And that's my concern about it, is how fast will this thing develop and how fast will new, variants and new platforms actually grow up out of this thing.
Yeah, and once you kind of have like, hey, we figured out this UX element, like the ability to rapidly fork that by entrepreneurial malware
Yep.
writers, like that to me feels like somewhat of the harder part, right? If you're talking about hitting your maximum potential addressable market, right?
Exactly.
Is hey, like we figured out this part. It does remind me, you brought up ransomware, that when we saw ransomware as a service pop up, it was that dashboard mentality of, you don't have to do anything. You literally just give me, where do you want this going? Here, take your money. After base, and essentially, and kind of bringing that plug and play, for lack of a better term. So seeing that for malware as a service, certainly not a new industry, but definitely with that speed of development, two interesting bits here
Yep.
as well. Right before we get to our ad for today, though, CCL wrote in to say, 100% find current employee of a target company, send enticing offer, then send tech quiz, and hope target employees will use company device to execute quiz. Uh, they say the oldest tricks are the ones that work the best, and yeah, CCL, great point. Appreciate it. All right, before we move on, let's spend a few moments with our sponsor now, Conveyor. Got a scary security questionnaire to complete, and you'd rather have AI do it? Your InfoSec friends are making the switch from outdated RFP and compliance tools to Conveyor, the most accurate security questionnaire automation software on the market. The proof is in the AI. Customers are seeing 80 to 90% accurate auto generated answers by and decreasing the time spent on questionnaire answering by 91%. Try a free 1 week proof of concept at conveyor.com. Red Cross issues hacktivist rules. The International Committee of the Red Cross has published a set of rules in the European Journal of International Law regarding hacktivist activities in times of armed conflict. We've definitely seen this in light of the conflict, the war in Ukraine. It highlighted the rise in cyber attacks by civilians during war, impacting non-military targets, things like hospitals, something we cover every week here on cybersecurity headlines. The rules call for no direct cyber attacks against civilian objects and not to use malware that spreads indiscriminately or automatically. It also calls for no cyber attacks on humanitarian facilities, namely hospitals. So, Bob, some people find that having rules for war up to and including the Geneva Convention to be irrelevant, and they remain unconcerned about the ethics of warfare. The Red Cross is one of those organizations, though, you always find deep in the worst of a battlefield. They are not speaking from a diplomatic conference. They definitely always have boots on the ground, for lack of a better term, and they have had a degree of success in past wars and kind of maybe shaping behavior there, at least offering some humanitarian guidelines. Do you feel that they will be, I guess, listened to by cyber gangs who are not truly part of a country's legitimate military, or does this come down to aid considerations as well?
Boy, I wish it would be better than it probably is going to be, right? But I think it's an important piece to actually go out there and say.
Hmm.
Um, I remember, a couple of years ago with General Alexander and Snowden and some of those components of, so, cyber warfare that actually has human impact. Is that an act of war, right?
Yeah.
It's those types of conversations that are actually really important for us to start defining what, acceptable rules and boundaries are for those countries that want to. Now, obviously, with the Conti leaks and some of the other components out there, we've always known that yes, there are some organized crime groups that are a stone's throw away from government influence, right? And it can certainly be construed as acting on behalf of some of those governments. So I think it is an important thing to go out there and talk about and put down rules for. What I think will actually be potentially more impactful is going to be that, not necessarily influencing the gangs themselves, but influencing the government around that, right? Because most
Mhm.
of these folks exist because of either acceptance, because of a closer relationship, or at least knowing that they could be used if they ever need to. And that's kind of an arm's length agreement, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's an important piece that certainly we need to define what the structure is and define what the ideals are. But I think the actual impact is going to be from the government side of it, saying, "Hey, you got to cut that out," right?
Yeah.
Is at the end of the day that's what's going to influence them more than anything.
Yeah, I do think there is some values in staking. To completely agree with you that there are values in staking these principles here, and we've noted the rise of, I guess, uh, to your point, arm's length actors, on both sides of the war with Russia and Ukraine, and we talked about how that has kind of changed the way we think about cyber activity and warfare, but the Red Cross kind of bringing the humanitarian side as well, I think, is vital as
Yeah.
well. All right, next up here, researchers warn of 100,000 exposed ICS systems, power grids, traffic light systems, security and water systems. These are the niceties of life that BitSite has noted as being exposed and vulnerable on the internet through units such as sensors, actuators, switches, building management systems, and automatic tank gauges. The recent report said that this number is actually a year over year improvement since 2019. But we are still continuing to see attacks on these vital structures. Seems to be increasing, although that may just be kind of a, what is that, Bader Meinhof phenomenon, where once you see it, you can't unsee it. So, should we focus on this story, I guess, as good news that BitSite is seeing a reduction in vulnerable ICS systems, or a big old warning that 100,000 is, that is still a considerable number? Or I guess, how do we take both bits of that at the same time?
That's why I say I think it's both, right? I think it is again, a reminder,
Hmm.
right? That this is important. This is exposed out there. We do have to understand the implications, both from a company perspective, but also the overall public interest, right? A national security interest. I think if you look at what the administration is trying to do with some of the new cyber legislation rules as they're trying to put in place, even just the guiding principles and goals for each of the industries and critical infrastructure sectors, it's going to be a conversation that we keep on having throughout the years. My hope is that it's not a 10-year plan, that
Yeah.
it's more a little bit more immediate than that. But overall, I actually do take it as a good sign that that customers and companies are taking this more seriously, that they're worried about it, that they're looking into it. If you look at the explosion of IoT devices, the explosion of sensors, remote sensors for these types of manufacturing industries, it's actually not too terrible. I would expect it a little bit more exponential, as we progress into smart factories and progress into more and more sensors in the world. I would expect the vulnerabilities to actually be higher. So I'm actually okay with it so far,
Yeah.
but certainly there's a lot more to go.
Yeah, we're only focusing on the one element of number went down, but yeah, to the point of like the as a percentage, it probably even looks yeah, even better. So yeah, that's excellent perspective. Appreciate that. All right, next up here in our final story for today, cloud giants face UK competition probe over lock-in practices. The UK's Competition and Markets Authority, my favorite CMA, is launching a broad investigation into large cloud organizations, you know them, AWS, Google, and Microsoft, to determine whether large cloud companies make it difficult for businesses to move or use multiple providers, the vaunted dream of multi-cloud. These three companies account for 90% of cloud revenues in the UK. Key issues being scrutinized are the dreaded egress fees, charging customers to move data elsewhere, and interoperability, in which cloud companies make their procedures incompatible with other vendors, making moving obviously much more problematic. So, Bob, not unique to the UK, but it comes back to kind of the third party supplier question we talked about earlier, especially when another part of the same government is intent on improving opportunities for commerce by establishing reliable standards. Do you see such comments as political posturing, or is there a genuine antitrust style issue at stake, maybe more oligopolish because of the three giants in the room?
Right. So I think it's not just show. It's
Hmm.
not just trying to get political points on this. Anytime, and it's not just these three, right? Anytime that I see companies trying to make sure that you can't get out easily, that you can't transfer easily, that's the wrong way to develop stickiness of your customers.
Yeah.
Right. So at the end of the day, do you really have a market differentiator that makes you unique, that makes you better, that makes you different? The question is, are you starting to feel like you're a commodity base?
Hmm.
Ooh,
Yeah.
right. All of a sudden, we really don't want to be into the commodity world. But to some degree, I think that's what the infrastructure as a service is starting to get to, and where the rest of kind of the private sector wants you to go. Right. So I really would prefer to see that flexibility, that ability to move between providers is accepted, is appreciated, and as a board director, as a leader, as an executive, you're asking the harder question of, okay, so why don't they want to stay with us versus how can we make them keep
Yeah.
around?
How can we make it more painful for them to go anywhere else? Yeah. I mean, that's why every reinvent, right? There's a trillion tiny little microservices that they add,
Right.
right? So to address very specific niches and stuff like that, add these services. And I think part of that is to not just make it incompatible, here's our value add, why we're not just the dumb pipe of cloud compute or the dumb pipe of storage or something like that. So, I do think I'm of two minds of this because there's definitely obviously barriers between all of these. I mean, ask anyone about an egress fee and you'll see the tears start to fall. But I do think there is a recognition of, hey, if we're not going to just be that dump pipe, especially if we're the AWS in the room, we need to add some sort of value add on top of that. We're seeing that with hardware too. They're coming up with dedicated hardware for instances and stuff. So
Yeah. Well, and we're seeing it within licenses,
yeah.
right? So people are playing, well, if you want to come to our cloud, the licenses might move. But if you go to someone else's, you got to rebuy those licenses, right?
Oh,
And that type of stuff is more what's frustrating from a customer perspective. And even we do look at it when we talk about contracts. So
sure.
I think eventually it does start to hinder the amount of new customers you can pull in.
Yeah. And as CCL points out in the chat here, Google Cloud Storage does not understand S3 and vice versa. And that's just, oh, come on. You got to be S3 compliant. Come on. So before we close up shop here, got to acknowledge some more people in the chat. We had a really great conversation going. Let me just see here. Barbara Lynch, regulations, two exclamation points. I mean, probably, I mean, in the UK it seems like more open perhaps than the US, but wouldn't be surprised. And Barbara also said we're having a great conversation, so thank you, Barbara. I appreciate that. We also have some thoughts about the Red Cross hacktivist rules coming in here. We had David Cross saying it sounds like the Cyber Geneva Convention discussion again. And then James Driscoll was commenting on that and said, just like the Geneva Convention, he wonders if the US and its allies are going to be the only countries to abide by it. I would say that's still worth it.
Mhm.
Even if it's one-sided, but it is certainly is an interesting point to bring up. And as our producer Steve points out, David Cross has no relation to the Red Cross. This is perhaps my favorite disclosure of all time. So thank you for that, Steve. All right. Well, Bob, before we get out of here, was there any story for you? We've heard from our commenters, maybe what they liked, but what was a story that stood out to you, a thumbs up or an eye roller for you?
For me, it's a thumbs up on Bunny Loader, right? One, because of
Oh
the
yeah.
name, gotta give it to the name, but overall, like I said, the speed at which this thing came about and the speed by which it had impact. Yeah, I deal with a lot of startups, I deal with a lot of venture capital, and it feels very much like they've understood this type of how do we grab market, how do we grab users, right? User experience, and make it easy for everyone to do. I think that's one of the most dangerous things that we have as defenders is that type of understanding in organized crime.
I do wonder if the bunny loader people are going, are we developing a product or a feature? Like if they're having that conversation now. The more I learn about malware and cybercrime, it's like they're just regular organizations that are
Yep.
like operating outside the law. So I love that. So Bob, where can people find you on the internet if they want to keep tabs on what you're doing in the cyberspace?
Always on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect out and reach out.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Bob Schuetter, the CISO at Ashland. Truly spectacular conversation. We will have to have you back. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Many thanks.
Thanks also to our sponsor, Conveyor. Spend 91% less time on security questionnaires with the most accurate AI generated answers on the market. And thank you to all of our commenters today. Really appreciate it. David Cross, CCL, Barbara Lynch, I need to scroll around because there's so many. James Driscoll, one David Spark. He's a seems like he's a nice commenter for sure. Thank you all for participating. It means a lot. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Weekend Review Show. So make sure you're subscribed to the CISO Series YouTube channel. And you can also join us next Friday for Super Cyber Friday, where our topic will be hacking the risks and rewards of AI, an hour of critical thinking about how to safely embrace this emerging technology. If you want to check that out, go to CISOseries.com to register. And in the meantime, you can still get your daily news fix through cybersecurity headlines every single day. Give us 6 minutes. We'll get you all caught up. Don't worry about it. We got you covered. Until the next time we meet, I'm Rich Stroffolino, reminding you to have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOseries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.